So after the article was published, George, that you wrote on, I think the title was "Why I'm Glad We Marched and Why I Wish We Didn't," speaking of our response to really the Black Lives Matter movement rally that took place this summer in Augusta. I had conversations with some of you guys in terms of how you were processing it. And the more we talked about it, it was obvious that we need to move towards one another and hear one another. And so that's why we're here today. That's why we came together at that time, was to talk about it. And so that's what we want to do now is just talk about it. How did it make you feel when you first read the article? And then, what you agreed with, what you were bothered by. And George, when he heard that was a concern, he said, well, we need to get together, and I'll let him talk about how he was feeling about it. But even when he heard that it was even possible that he might have hurt your feelings, and
right.
So that's why we got together. That was the context of it. And so you talked to me, but let's just share about when you first read the article, how did it make you feel, and what was your reaction?
When I first read the article, I was like, oh, wow. First of all, the title was I was like, all right, here we go. And so, but when I first read the article, I was like, wow, there's a lot of deep truths in this article. And I needed to read this article like 3 or 4 more times just to be able to process it. But on the other side of it, I was, to say a least bit, slightly offended, almost in a sense. I felt as if I was slightly spoken for, or even kind of almost associated with the Black Lives Matter movement from a certain standpoint almost. And so for me, it was really confusing, and I just really needed clarification. And I was more so just slightly hurt by it. But I trusted Pastor George, and I knew that he wouldn't just write an article just to do it. So.
Now, you talked to Eric, and I know he's not here, but why don't you share some of the things he was feeling?
Yeah, the words that I was hearing were things like misunderstood, spoken for. It had an air, in his opinion, it had an air of white heroism, and almost like, somebody had to come and speak for these black people and come and help them think through these things and whatever. So it was it was less angry and more hurt because he felt spoken for, I think.
What about you, Will?
I would say for me, it was more so I was confused about the whole article. I was wondering if it was the right time to release this article, in light of what had just happened. I didn't think that was the right time to release something at the time. Just because he's a white pastor, and like Mike was saying, speaking against this movement. I didn't know that was the right time for him to release something. I really expected a lot of backlash, from the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think I was confused in that, and I was also confused that why it was on Facebook. Like I just felt like something like that should have not been on social media. Just because I think it was an outlet for some people to say, hey, look at my church, we have it all together. But really we don't. We're still fighting and struggling, to figure things out ourselves.
So that made you feel like it's gone public, but we hadn't talked about it?
Yes. Yeah. It just went public, and we never had a chance to sit down and discuss this ourselves.
Now, George, when you heard that these guys were hurt, I just love for you to just share how that made you feel and what you were thinking when you heard that.
Well, I felt horrible. I didn't feel defensive, which I would usually feel if somebody's questioning what I preach or what I write. But hearing from you, my good friends, and fellow leaders, I was crushed. And part of my disposition anyway is to walk around with a constant feeling of guilt, that I'm always guilty. I've just got to figure out what it is. I mean, last night I was coming home on Washington Road. I saw blue lights behind me. I just pulled off to the parking lot. I just assumed I was guilty. Went by me. So I automatically feel guilty. And then I think with my my personal history as a Southerner and as a recovering racist, I just assumed they must be right. I did something wrong. And then I think you said something about going from A to Z in your thinking. Sunday we hadn't talked. We didn't talk until Monday. Article came out later in the week, so I didn't know you had a young professionals a retreat. So I get into the pulpit and I see everybody's gone. I thought I've run everybody.
Here's the campus outreach retreat.
Everybody in their 20s. I've offended everybody. So I was just very, very heavy-hearted that I had wounded you.
You know, when we talked about that we need to get together with these guys and hear their hearts, one of the guys I was talking to, he's not here now, but this was where it really just was so sad and even fearful. But I said, well, just tell me, you know, when you're feeling, you're reading the article and feeling like an outsider to your own church, you know, what's going through your mind? And he said, well, you know, people have told me you can't trust whites and you can't trust that church. You know, family members have told me that. But he said, that's in the back of my mind. But he said, I just thought, well, here we go again. Well, I'll just kind of drift away and I'll change churches in a few months and it'll never change. And I said, you know, that's not acceptable. You know, we're gonna lean in and we're gonna move towards one another. And he said, I didn't say I wanted that. He said, that's just how I feel. You know, I really feel, and we all feel that way when we face that kind of conflict. Let's talk about the meeting itself. So we're there. We got there. Let's talk about what was helpful in terms of understanding the one thing in particular, John, that I don't think everybody even knew was your role in. Why don't you share about that? Because I think that helped a lot of folks, even knowing that you were part of that.
So Pastor George had asked me about a week prior to the article being released. He had asked me to read through it in its entirety and send him any concerns or help him to see his own blind spots, which automatically I thought that just made me think a lot more of him as a pastor and a leader, that he would have the humility and want to have someone who quite frankly doesn't have the training that he has to speak into whatever, be allowed to speak into those things and submit himself to that. So yeah, I read the article a few times, and it took me the entirety of the week, like Mike was saying. I wanted to be sure that I read it as well as I could and as objectively as I could. And I wanted to not only read the article from my own perspective, but try to get into his shoes and why he might be saying the things that he's saying and articulate them in the way that he is. And then I sent him back an email and said, okay, here's 3 or 4 things that I think I appreciate. First, I just wrote a lot of the things that I really appreciated about the article. And then I said, here are a couple of things where I think when I read that, I cringe on the inside because I don't know. I know that you're not because I know you and we have a relationship. I know that you're not trying to say something that might be offensive or hurtful, but here's something that I think. Here are a couple places of that, and he had no problems with changing those things. So the final copy that actually came out to the public was already actually revised by me, and I had no issues with. But I think from speaking to some of my friends here, they had no idea that anybody had revised it or anything like that. And I think even that idea that had already happened helped them feel a little bit more relieved that they weren't necessarily being spoken for without being represented in some kind of way. So
Was that helpful for you to know when you found out that John was part of the editing process?
Oh yeah, that helped out a lot. Just to know that he looked through it and I trust him. So, that was a big relief off knowing that.
How did the meeting itself help you process all this?
It was great. I mean, just like John was talking about Pastor George's character, it's just that he would allow us to come in. Like, he cared so much about us that we came in and we got to speak to him, one-on-one and tell him my issues, that we had with the article. I mean, I think that itself speaks for just the type of pastor he is. And then also knowing that there are people behind the scenes that are working to try to make our church more like the kingdom of heaven, and that we never even heard about. I think that was great to hear about that, and I think that kind of like brought our comfort levels down, and we were able to understand and see it through his lens and see that.
I think one thing I remember you saying, which was just made me so embarrassed of myself, is we didn't know it was coming.
Yeah.
And
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
I mean, what a boneheaded thing on my part, that I've been working on it since June or whatever the date was, summer. And I was asking for feedback from various people who participated. But I should have included everybody who actually marched that day in the process, not just representatives. And so I don't think I apologized at our meeting as forthrightly as I should have, but I do apologize to you for that. I know I haven't, because you weren't able to be at that meeting. But I do ask your forgiveness for that. It wasn't intentional, but it was unthoughtful for me not to have worked that through with you, especially given the fact that you were in the march and I wasn't. I was out of town. So, thank you for being
And I think, I wasn't sure what the meeting was I didn't know what was gonna happen. So sparks could have flown from either side. And I was just kind of preparing myself for that, to like, okay, try to handle whatever happens with some portion of humility, partially because it's not just a critique. In my mind, it wasn't just a critique of Pastor George's work, but also kind of, as a black man, how did you miss some of these things? That's kind of what I was bringing into this. Like, man, did I just miss something? But what was helpful, I think, was that everybody, even though there was some disagreement and there's a little bit of tension in the room, everybody was willing to listen, which I think should be expected, but isn't always the case. And everybody was humble enough or honest enough to say it how it was, how they really felt about the situation, and having those two tensions of the humility to listen and the willingness to really say it how it is, I think was pretty special.
I'm going to hit pause for a second because, Gay, we're glad you're here,
Okay.
and there is a reason for that. You've walked through a similar experience after your article that was written, published at the Gospel
Sure.
Coalition website,
Sure.
and I'm sure have had to work through these questions of how do I deal with the disappointment and misunderstanding of even my motives. Can you share with us just a little bit about your own experience and how that might be helpful to even these guys here?
Sure. Well, this summer my daughter, Anna Clark, married an African-American gentleman, Glenn Wiggins. And I wanted to kind of chronicle that wedding and the process I went through of accepting, really, a mom accepts really any suitor until, they go through a strict assessment when it's your daughter, as you know. So I wanted to chronicle that, but at the heart of my desire of writing this article was to try to encourage other, particularly white parents in my socioeconomic background who might have misgivings about their son or daughter marrying outside their race, to at least initially empathize with them, but to take them on a journey to a different place, to where they could not just tolerate a in-law who is a different color, but openly rejoice at that union. That was my heart's desire in writing the article. And like George, I have African American friends that I asked to read the article. I've got, particularly at work, I have a cherished relationship with a young woman who is, you know, we joke about having this close relationship, but she's Zig and I'm Zag. You know, she's flaming Democrat. I tend to vote conservative. And we smile that the only thing we have in common is Christ. So I knew when I wrote this article that I could give it to her and say, now tell me critically if there's anything offensive here, or even if it doesn't need to see the light of day, it can just go into, you know, it can lie in a bird cage. It does not need to be printed. So she liked it. Then it went through a critique group that I have that liked it. And then it went through the Gospel Coalition, where several editors, one is an African American, they went through and read that article as well. So that went through several different screening processes. And so I was confident, ignorantly so, that it would be generally well received by everyone, you know, or at least maybe somebody might just dismiss it as I was completely unprepared for 600 angry tweets within 24 hours. But when you have that, like George, I can identify with feeling crushed and devastated. One thing that was a little different in my situation was that I had people angry for different reasons. I had a group of white supremacists that were angry that I would suggest that a biracial marriage would be God-honoring. And then I had African Americans who felt like what I said was racist and hurtful and insensitive. So to process that, a couple things happened. One is I just took the white supremacist point of view and just set it aside and said, I'm not going to consider your point of view. It's not in line with what I know God's word is. It's not shalom. And so you don't have a say. I really don't care what you think. That was step one. And step two was, how do I embrace my African brothers and sisters in a loving, gracious way? And, you know, our church, as we've been learning together to love each other, to you know, work side by side, the two words I think that have been bubbled up and that were helpful in past conversations with African Americans at our church, and particularly in Sunday school classes where we talked about this openly, two words I thought of were empathy and humility. And so as I prayed through this, I thought, well, I wanted to communicate how very valuable my African American brothers and sisters who disagreed with me were. And I can say that, you know, there were not everyone that was angry with the article. I had just as many African Americans saying, well, this touched me, and I see where you're coming from. But I did want to reach out to people who are legitimately hurt and say, how can I care for them? How can I demonstrate? So as I prayed through that, the answer in my mind was to take the article down as a show of respect. And hopefully that the conversation that we were having that was life-giving, that was helpful, would continue. But to take the article down and say to my African American brothers and sisters, I love you more than I love the desire to be heard, more than I love being known as a good writer or a good mother-in-law. All of those things I lay aside because I want to reach out to my African American brothers and sisters and say, I love you. So that was step one. Step two was harder, and that was to reacquaint myself practically with how Proverbs over and over again, soft answer turns away wrath. Gentleness breaks a king's bones, meaning that our initial reaction when we disagree is we want to lunge forward and just convince you, be the Holy Spirit. Don't you get it? Don't you see my point of view? And I think what Scripture would tell us to do is almost the exact opposite. To lay it, even if give up the right to want to be right, even. Lay it aside and say to your brothers and sisters, let me hear you. Let me receive fully what your point of view is. Let me understand it. And you have to be humble to do that. It means that my point of view is not as important as your point of view. So I hope that in the process with Twitter and Facebook and some private messages and things that the goal was to hear my African American brothers and sisters, hear them out, try to understand where they're coming from, to offer empathy. Looking back, I began to see, some lights came on. I see that in a different light now. That's really not what I meant, but I can see where you came to that conclusion. Most people that knew me, it didn't occur to them to take my article in a negative sense, because they knew me, they had a context, they knew my daughter and son-in-law. They've seen me interact together with them. But those that didn't, they didn't have the benefit of that context. But in that process, several people approached me and said, well, just don't worry about what, they don't know you. They don't know you. You don't need to worry about what they think. And that's the world's advice. That's the world's advice. But I think the Lord's advice to me in that moment was to offer empathy, lay aside my point of view, try to fully understand their point of view. I've learned a lot in the last 6 to 8 weeks and opened my eyes. And I've began some really neat relationships with some people who are in different perspective than I am. And I hope that in the process that some bridges were built that had the article not had the reaction it had, that wouldn't be there. But one of the most beautiful things, the most gospel-centered thing that happened as a humbling thing that happened as my article is I had a lot of angry folks on Twitter just lashing out and saying, I hope she drowns in a car, in a lake, and she drives her car off a cliff. And they were sending me pictures where they marred pictures of my children's engagement pictures. And I knew they were speaking out of anger and hurt. So I didn't try to respond or rebuttal to that. I just tried to say, look, I'm trying to understand your point of view. I'm trying to listen. Please pray for me to understand. But in that process, a lot of African American brothers and sisters who were angry with me, deeply angry with me, started to turn and boldly on Twitter said, this lady's trying. We don't need to be beating her at this point. She's our sister in Christ. We need to be shielding her. And they began to shield me, verbally, personally. One night I came home from work and a beloved African American brother was sitting on my porch, and I just kind of smiled at him. He says, I got your back, sis. I got your back. He was worried someone was going to come to my house, and people did come to my house. But that was such a beautiful, I felt so undeserving of their love and protection. I created the chaos that they were shielding me from. And to me, that was just such a beautiful, beautiful picture of the gospel.
Well, go respond or comment.
Yeah, specifically to the article, prior to the article coming out, I have never met you formally. But at Georgia Southern, I was a part of Glenn's life and invested in him. And I know Mike was there at that same time as well. And I know that you know him from his time here. So when the article first came out, my wife, like all of the firestorm had already started. So it had already been taken down, but somehow through some back alleys of the internet, my wife had found the article
Back alleys.
and let me read it. And I read it and I said, okay, yeah, and originally I was like, yeah, there's some definitely some things I wish were said differently, and some things that I don't necessarily agree with. And I'd read other people's and even pastors' responses to it and said I can see where they're coming from. But then I contacted Glenn and realized how it had not just affected, like it wasn't just an article that affected other people, it affected you, and it affected him, and it affected Anna. And then that's when my perspective started to change. And I read the article again, and I said, okay, yeah, definitely I still wish some things were said differently, worded differently, whatever. But man, can't we give some grace? Can't we allow some room for growth for people? Can't we have a form of communication with people that allows them to say things that might be stepping on our toes, but we assume the best rather than assuming the worst? Mm-hmm. And that's what I started to realize, was that some of the articles that I was reading, if I didn't know you and we go to the same, we're at the same church, then these people that are from hundreds of miles away, they definitely don't know you. And the assumption was more that you were trying to do something negative than you were actually, rather than assuming in love that maybe that she is trying to do something positive here. And I think that's where my perspective shifted on the whole thing.
Well, you said something even coming into our meeting that helps you, and I think it's instructive, really, in light of what you were sharing, that empathy and humility is necessary in relationships, but even in responding to things that we feel awkward about. But you said you were at a racial reconciliation conference and you heard something that even helped you in thinking about how we were going to work through this. Why don't you share that?
Well, I had the privilege of going to LDR weekend all in St. Louis, and one of their themes was we are the household of God, and we are becoming the household of God. And I just stopped and I paused and I was like, okay, the household of God, that means all believers, rich believers, poor believers, white believers, black believers, Hispanics. We all are at the table. And the only reason any of us have a seat at the table is because of what Jesus has done for us. And because we have a seat at that table, that doesn't mean that if I disagree with something that you say, or if you get offended by something that I say, that I get up and leave the table. We're family. Family don't leave each other. We work it out. We stick to it, and we grind through it together, and we pursue each other. I think that was, after reading Pastor George's article, my mom used to tell me all the time, practice what you preach, son. And so that was something that just kind of stuck in my head. Am I just going to initially be offended by this, not even knowing Pastor George's perspective, and just leave the table? Or am I going to sit at the table and hear it out and work it out and be reconciled to each other? And that was what I was encouraged by. I didn't attend the meeting, but after talking to Foreman and after talking to Will and Eric, I was encouraged by how we pursued each other, stood at the table together, and left through grace with each other. So that was something that...
I was rereading my article last night with all the suggestions that you had made, or the points that you said, this sounded like white heroism, or this sounded like you're speaking for us, and what it was amazing to me how differently I read my own article as a result of being so lovingly challenged and at some points corrected by you, that as I read the article again, without looking for the points that you brought up, I was offended at some of the same statements that you said offended you, and what is happening here? And it struck me. It's very much like marriage, that a Christian marriage should be cause the individuals to flourish beyond what they could have been by themselves. That, by being married to Jackie, I've experienced the world more richly than I ever would have on my own. I see things entirely differently. She's filled out my perspective. She's filled out my joy. And Martin Luther King Jr. said that racism is a brain sickness. It's a deformity. So I have a deformity by my sin, first of all, and then if I stay within my racial perspective and never experience and listen to another perspective, I stay deformed. I only see things from one perspective, and that one perspective is not full. So the joy I've been living in lately is you've helped me to become more whole. It's not that we were talking about this is my point and you've got to see it this way, it's right or wrong. It's that together, I hope, we looked at the same thing and we saw different perspectives, and not that we've completely adopted each other's perspective, but we've added color to it, which makes it more beautiful. And I want to thank you for that. I do see where it did offend me when I read it the second time when I said, we are not going to do that again. And I thought, who am I to say we are not going to do that again? I can't speak for these guys. And there was another point about where I said something like, referring to you, that you're being cast in a negative light because other people are misbehaving. And that really, I read that again, that offended white and black. And part of that was an editing thing, that I didn't show more understanding for why some people are misbehaving. There are economic reasons, there are familial reasons, and just the way that was starkly put was hurtful or sounded dismissive. So I just had to share that it's really fulfilling to think that I will, as a result of being related to you in this family, and hopefully you being related to me, that we will discover more beautiful aspects of what it means to be created in the image of God, and see the world more accurately together than we ever could have on our own.
I think one comment that I heard a couple of times from a couple of these guys after that meeting was, we kind of concluded that meeting with you just kind of telling us the perspective from which you were writing it, and relationships with city officials that you have, and their specific points of views on certain things, and how that shaped and molded your perspective. And I think even knowing that also kind of bore on us and made us say, oh, well, now I see why maybe he said certain things the way that he said it. And just reading the article, you wouldn't know that, oh, he's coming from a specific angle, and has not just our church but others in mind as well in writing these things. And because of that, certain things were worded the way they were, even if there were corrections that could have been made. But it helped us say, okay, we don't have all angles on this whole thing either. We don't have, just because we're African Americans don't mean that we have we don't have a race card that we can just play and say, no, you offended the black people of the church, and so canceled. You know, it is a very much as we long for our white brothers and sisters to have some humility and empathy. We also have to bring that exact same humility and empathy in to bear on all these situations as well. And I think as you unpack some of your perspective, it helped all of us kind of see those same things, like, whoa, maybe we didn't see every angle that this thing was coming from. So
Now, not from a theatrical or production standpoint, but you felt strongly that we needed to capture this. Why was that so important that we need to capture this for our people? Why did you feel strongly about that?
Well, I don't think that we're going to arrive at understanding. We're not going to achieve the racial reconciliation that the Bible talks about, that's empowered by the gospel, just by writing things at each other. And then I just felt it was necessary to share more broadly the gospel as I experienced it from these guys, and maybe they experienced it from me, and as Gay has experienced it. I don't know that you can write that down. You know, the other thing I wanted to talk about is that it's not just a white-black issue, but it's a generational issue too. That I think I told you going into the meeting, and told you that I wasn't going to say anything in the meeting. I didn't deserve to say anything. I was just going to listen. I was going to write my notes. And then at some point, kind of turned the tables on me and asked me to speak, which meant sharing my emotions, which my generation is not so good at, right, Gay?
Amen.
And you are much better at it. And so my emotions came bubbling out in that meeting, which ended up being a little embarrassing for me, and then, but I think maybe helped you feel my perspective better. So I talked about things like that I felt hurt. It was silly, but I felt hurt that you'd marched without talking to me about it, and then that it was part of a Black Lives Matter march. I'm not sure we knew that going in, and I kept thinking about all of the law enforcement officials and justice officials who have helped us in our effort as a black-white community re-neighboring this community. And so African-American mayor, African-American judges, African-American U.S. attorney, African-American lawyers, African-American sheriff, and my reaction was, what are we saying we're telling these law enforcement officials that we're against them, and we don't want to say that because they have put their lives on the line, their reputations on the line. Some of them have been called Uncle Toms for even participating. So all of that kind of bubbled out of me, including when I said being accused of white heroism feels to me like what it must feel like when you were called an Uncle Tom. That somehow I'm making a friendship with you, or it's some kind of transactional relationship that I'm looking to find some fulfillment through. And Eric reacted to that, and made a very special point of hugging me afterwards and saying, I never realized how that made you feel. All of that enabled me to experience the gospel more deeply. And I told him, and I think I've said similar things to others of you, that I don't think I could believe the gospel as deeply as I do if you had not loved me the way you have. Like when I came out church Sunday and I said, Mike, you're not going to give up on me, are you? And you grabbed me and nearly broke my neck. And so we're not leaving. We're not going anywhere. We're family. I just wanted to. I wanted somebody else to experience that somehow, what I've experienced.
It's like pretty much how Jason Metlin kind of pursued a group of African Americans, and we did a study on racial reconciliation. And one thing that we all learned is that, one, we have our natural biases, and two, one hard pill for me to swallow was I learned that I have my racist tendencies, and only the gospel can overcome any of that. Such as something.
No.
Was saying that the gospel overcomes racism. The big question in front of us, a lot of people would say racism is the unforgivable sin. When you're labeled a racist, often the person, that angry, hurt, wounded person that's pointing at you and saying you're a racist, is not inviting you to repent and reconcile and be in fellowship with them. They are in the process of discarding you. So that what I'd like to hear your perspective on is racism the unforgivable sin? And as we self-professing recovering racists, is there any hope for us?
I guess one thing that I've learned, and it came through a family in the church. They pursued just a group of African Americans, a group of us, to kind of do a racial reconciliation study. And through that study, we all learned just that we all have our natural biases and our natural stereotypes. But the hard pill for me to swallow was that I am a racist, and I have my racist tendencies, and that only the gospel can help me overcome those racist tendencies. So would you say it's the unforgivable sin? I would say no. I would say pretty much by nature we are all racist, and we all have to overcome that.
And I think if you're speaking from a perspective outside of the church, it might be a different answer. So if you don't have Christ who bled and died for you and therefore bought you with the price of his own blood, and now you don't belong to yourself anymore, if you still belong to yourself, then you can have these unforgivable sins and you can carry those burdens and hold those grudges. But when we come to the cross, the playing field gets even. And this is something that I'm just passionate about, in my job, discipling and investing in specifically young African American dudes. Most of my time is fighting for us to show the kind of grace that Christ has shown us. So is it the unforgivable sin? I would say if you're outside of Christ, maybe so. Especially in our culture, I think, like you said, there's nothing worse in our culture to be called than a racist or homophobe or whatever. There's nothing worse to be called than those things in our culture. But I think once we get into the church, we only enter the church through the blood of Christ. And the blood of Christ says that we're so sinful that we can't get ourselves there in the first place. So we've all entered through grace. And because of that, we've actually got to so there's some practicality that's got to come through the gospel. The gospel's got to make us practically say, okay, well, because I've offended Christ in this way, there is no such thing as an unforgivable sin to anybody, including somebody that fumbles over their words and says something racist. Even at and I'll keep names to myself, but even at the Black Lives Matter rally that we were at, about to march with them, there was an old white guy that came out, and the first thing he said was, and I really think he meant the best out of all these things, but one of the first things he said was, man, this rap music is destroying our country. And I said, he said, this rap music is destroying our country. And then he said something about, he said something and wanting to empower the Negro community. And, when I first hear that coming from anybody's mouth, there's a tension that I feel. But I think again, when you come to the cross, it makes you have to see things through a different lens and hear things through a different lens and give the benefit of the doubt. And I think even then was able to do that only because I know that when I say things to certain people, they have to extend grace to me as well, and especially Christ, who knows all things and sees all things and knows even the intentions of my heart. So.
Thank y'all.